Few people know that the famous assassin of John Kennedy, Lee Harvey Oswald, lived in the USSR for quite a long time. Why did he go there and why did he go back? The identity of this man has long been the subject of numerous conspiracy theories. Few manage to pass by such a tasty excuse as life in the USSR. What if this Oswald was recruited by Soviet intelligence? What if he was a deeply undercover agent, living only in anticipation of the fatal order? Too many questions that most have no answers to. Oswald can rightfully be considered a wild child of his time. He was born in New Orleans in 1939. His childhood was not the happiest, to put it mildly. His father died early, and his mother, unable to feed little Oswald and his two brothers, could think of nothing better than to send them to an orphanage. Later, however, the situation changed for the better. The mother was able to take her children from the state institution, but since she had no education, she had to constantly move from place to place in search of another, usually short-lived job. And where the mother went, her children went too. Circumstances developed in such a way that even before turning 17, Oswald had to change about 12 schools. He simply did not have enough time to make any stable friendships. The guy did not think about his future career after completing his studies. Why, when he had an example of an older brother who became a Marine? Oswald served in Japan, in the city of Atsugi. Later, some historians and even Sergeant Hartmann from Kubrick's Full Metal Jacket called him a natural-born killer and a marksman from God, but in reality, everything was a little different. For some time, Oswald really showed good results in shooting, but, for example, his marksman scores clearly did not reach the standard. There were also lesser marksmen, so Oswald did not stand out in any way among his fellow soldiers. Apparently, Oswald did not make any great friends in the army either, since he spent all his free time as much as it can be free in the army reading. He became interested in socialism, and after some time even began to study Russian. Not the most obvious occupation for an American Marine. Oswald, of course, did not come close to Dostoevsky or Chekhov, but he earned the nickname Oswaldkovich from his comrades. Oswaldkovich became so interested in the USSR that he decided to quit the army and spend all his savings on a trip to the first state of workers and peasants on Earth. There were no direct flights from the States to the USSR at that time, but our hero did not look for easy ways, first to France, then to England, and then to Finland. And only there was he able to get the coveted Soviet visa. In the fall of 1959, he arrived in Moscow by train. And the first thing he did, as soon as he arrived in Moscow, was to ask, no, demand, Soviet citizenship. The news of the former Marine's escape excited the public. True, the American one. The reports of Oswald's démarche got their place on the front pages of newspapers, but that was all. The thing is that Oswald did not possess any military secrets, his education was a pittance, what good could he be? Another young man who read too many paperback books and decided to ruin his life. Ah, youth. Oddly enough, the USSR thought about it in much the same way. No parades were held in honor of Oswald's arrival. Everyone understood that there was no use in such a defector. Moreover, at that time the relations between the USSR and the USA were quite good. Eisenhower received Khrushchev at home. The leaders of the countries, although not without bickering, but quite peacefully discussed the possibility of the two countries coexisting. And then some greenhorn, arrives and spoils all the fun. Oswald realized that he was the architect of his own happiness. Therefore, when he was informed about the refusal to issue citizenship, he went and tried to commit suicide. The death of an American citizen, especially under such murky circumstances, was not in the plans of the Soviet government, so they thought about it and decided to keep this Oswald. True, he did not receive the coveted passport, he had to be content with a residence permit. And also, to leave Moscow and go to the glorious city of Minsk. At that moment, Oswald tensed up. He was counting on entering Moscow State University and getting an education there. Oswald didn't know what exactly he was going to study, and in general, all he knew about Moscow State University was that it was the biggest and coolest Soviet university, and studying there was the cherished dream of every Soviet person between the ages of 17 and 30. It seemed that Oswald hadn't even asked himself the question of whether they would take him to Moscow State University. Having learned that Minsk was not in Siberia, Oswald breathed a sigh of relief. He was also informed that he would be provided with a job at his new place, and as for paying for housing and living expenses, the Red Cross would help him with that. That is, Oswald would have almost 2 salaries. Oswald ignored it. Money was of little concern to him at that moment, and he had a very vague idea of the purchasing power of Soviet money. It's worth saying that Oswald was looked after, cared for. He was given an apartment in one of the central districts of Minsk, and his salary, together with payments from the Red Cross, was almost the same as the director's. Oh, yes, about work. Yesterday's Marine became a turner at the local radio plant. To be honest, Oswald turned out to be a lousy turner. However, the management was not particularly upset. The main thing is that he was busy and did not hang around where he was not needed. His co-workers treated Alec, that's what Oswald was nicknamed in his new place. After all, it was not Oswaldkovich to call him, quite tolerantly, although sometimes they were tempted to get into trouble with him. The thing is that Alec had a SOSO character, and even in his new place he managed to get into trouble. So, having mastered the Russian language enough to use curses, Oswald decided to call one of his colleagues a Russian pig. Despite the fact that all the employees of the plant were informed about how to behave in relation to this turner from New Orleans, the insulted man almost saved the life of President Kennedy. But it did not work out. The workers saved Oswald from reprisal. It is interesting that for some time the issues of guardianship and upbringing of Oswaldkovich in Minsk were handled by the future president of the Republic of Belarus, one of those who signed the Belavez Accords, Stanislav Shushkevich. The future president had a good command of English and was a rather progressive young man, but there was no close communication between him and Oswald. Oswald could shout as much as he wanted about how he liked living in the USSR, but all his knowledge of the country and communism did not go beyond slogans. Oswald began to be openly bored. In one of the entries in his diary, he complains about life and tries to solve a question worthy of Shakespeare: where to spend such a huge salary, if there is nowhere to go in Minsk? There is not even a bowling alley here. Thoughts about falling pins, apparently, were for him a kind of memory of America, which he once, so rashly, left. Suffering from a lack of entertainment, Oswald decided to seek solace in female company. Here, it should be said, Oswald was a fine fellow. Women liked him, and he liked them. He had many girlfriends in Minsk, but the one he liked most was Marina Prusakova, a colleague who worked in a neighboring workshop. Oswald turned on all his charm and soon the couple got married. A couple of months later, a child was born, a daughter, who was christened June. But tears were increasingly visible in Oswaldkovich's eyes. It began to dawn on him that the USSR that he knew from books was a little different from what it really was. Many Soviet customs and habits, for example, gathering for lectures or meetings after an 8-hour shift, caused him genuine misunderstanding. And this is also taking into account the fact that, thanks to his august origin, Oswald was exempted from many burdensome duties. So, in the spring of 1962, Oswald thought about it and applied for permission to leave for the United States. The Soviet Union didn't hold him back, and the Americans didn't even notice his absence. His wife went with him to their new homeland. At home, Oswaldkovich's life was clearly not going well. No one was going to give him an apartment in the city center and a salary that was several dozen times higher than the subsistence minimum. The family needed money. And Oswald gradually became radicalized. He matured until the moment when he went down in history on November 22, 1963. When the USSR learned of John Kennedy's death, the Soviet government almost immediately handed over to the Americans almost all the papers related to Oswald's trip 2 years earlier. There were many forces in America that believed that the communists were behind the murder of the beloved president, so it was necessary to convince sensible leaders of their innocence as quickly as possible. Lee Harvey Oswald is an example of a man who, in all his troubles, looked for someone else. Someone was always in his way: blacks, Freemasons, communists, Cubans, the Italian-American mafia, his boss at work, and a dozen other enemies, both small and large. Only one thing is clear: this man could not stay in one place for a long time and was always dissatisfied with everything. Subsequently, information appeared in the press that Oswald was not a stranger to domestic violence. For example, his wife, who was taken out of the Soviet Union, suffered from it more than once. Oswald himself made no attempt to understand the political situation in any meaningful way. The Warren Report, a document summarizing the work of American intelligence agencies during the investigation of the assassination of the president, contained eloquent information. Oswald was a fan of reading paperback books. The very same. The notorious pulp fiction. There is nothing shameful in it, but for a person with virtually no education and no critical thinking skills, such reading became an explosive mass. What came of it everyone knows.